I am going to begin with what I will admit is an unfairly broad, vague question, and that is just, in your view, what is conservatism?
Well, have you heard the famous definition of Richard Weaver that William F. Buckley liked to use to torture people? Do you know that story?
I know the story. I don't
Well,
remember the
yeah.
definition.
Well, the line is, I'll give you a sensible answer in a minute. But one reason it's hard is that Richard Weaver, whose great book "Ideas Have Consequences" is more often cited than read, he once said, I have to laugh already. Conservatism is a paradigm of essences towards which the phenomenology of the world is held in continuing approximation, which is helpful to absolutely no ordinary
Yeah.
human being, right? I
I
mean,
do recall Buckley said that that was as close to an exact approximation of the
right.
term as he could ever you couldn't improve upon that.
Right. Yeah. So my more common sense, accessible version of what amounts to almost the same thing is conservatism. I think is the search for the unchanging ground of changing experience. I mean, well, Russell Kirk had a pretty good phrase for this. He talked about the permanent things. So, what are the permanent things? Well, human nature is the main one, I think. Custom changes. Our clothing styles change, our musical styles change, our tastes in literature change. But fundamental human nature does not. We're rational creatures. We have, I think, a bent toward the transcendent or trying to discover what is transcendent about our existence and the meaning of the universe and so forth. Philosophy consists in many cases of the important questions that it is difficult or maybe impossible to answer completely. So that's why we're sort of always at sea. And so, the unchanging ground, what doesn't change is human nature, the endurance of institutions like the family, law is important. The left or the revolutionary mind wants to sweep all that away. They think we can create a new or perfect world just on our own will alone, which is deeply destructive of the permanent things, or it would seek to erase the unchanging ground of our changing experience. So that's the best definition I can do as a general matter. And I think I'll ramble one more sentence here. I do think that can apply even to economics, right? I
Mm.
mean, there are certain aspects of economics that reflect some permanent aspects of human nature, such as self-interest, self-preservation, and we are the best judges of our own interests and causes. And why even radical economics is a violation of the unchanging ground of human existence.
Well, that's certainly more succinct than I've often been able to achieve when I'm asked the same question. I usually have to rely on my betters, right? I appreciate Roger Scruton's notion that
Yeah,
it's the sentiment begins that good things are easily destroyed, but they're not easily created. So the
yeah,
appropriate posture towards life is one of conservation. And he even
yeah.
says, look, you don't have to be a conservative in a political sense to agree with that statement. Anybody reasonable would agree with that statement. And
Yeah.
so it's one of those things that I think is both true, but it's almost so simple that's like, yeah, but that doesn't really it doesn't differentiate it from a lot of other things, if you will. Maybe from the radicalist,
Right.
sure. And I, borrowing maybe from Russell Kirk, this whole notion of it's the negation of ideology. I know he didn't invent that term, but the
Right.
negation of ideology. And of course, you can only go so far there too, because was it Thomas Sowell or somebody comes up with, well, you have to have an ideology to combat an ideology, and I think in the sense Kirk meant it, I think he was correct. But it is necessarily, it seems to me, this frustratingly nebulous thing, that we can kind of put words around, but we're always going to struggle with really knowing that, well, here's what it actually means.
Yeah, I mean, the ideology, that's a tricky matter, ideology. I
Yeah.
understand exactly what Kirk meant and agree with what he meant. However, if you define ideology differently, it's just simply an organized idea system. That's more neutral. In other words, let me do it this way, which is easier. The kind of ideology that he's against, and again, I agree with being against this kind of ideology, would be like Marxism, that takes whatever phenomenon we see in the world and squeezes it into this ideological framework. It's very rigid, right?
Hmm.
My favorite example of this that's just come back into currency in recent years is, the famous Frankfurt School Marxists, right? What they start in the 20s and 30s, and why do they come up with their new theory of culture is more important than material relations? Well, it's because Marxism wasn't working. The working classes weren't revolting. All the prophecies of Marx that were supposed to be scientific weren't coming true. So it wasn't scientific. So they come up with a whole new theory because they're committed to the same end, a revolution.
Right.
They were deeply left. They even said, I forget which one of them, might have been Horkheimer, said, Really, I'm committed to Marxism, but I can't use that word anymore because it's discredited. So that's an example of ideology determining, and you bend the whole world to meet this ideological goal. In other words, there's no openness to learning from experience. There's no openness to challenging your fundamental premises. And you see that all over the place, right? So these days, everything is racism or sexism, structural
Hmm.
racism, patriarchy, right? We throw these things around, and or the left does, right? It's preposterous, but it really reflects a commitment to an ideological framework that really is very close-minded at the end of the day. So, I mean, I think good old-fashioned, what I call reform liberals, the people who say, I mean, this would be like the mid 20th century liberals, like I'll just say Arthur Schlesinger or Louis Hartz. They're impatient. They're critical of American capitalism, critical of America in a lot of other ways, but not, they don't reject it in total. And they think,
Hmm.
we make reform and progress toward a more equal and beneficent world. And then, the new left comes along in the 60s and said, nuts to all that, we need revolution. And that line can be a little fuzzy at the margins, but that's where we are. Is the new left has taken over the old left, and well, that was Tom. Sorry, as Tom Hayden's famous phrase in the '60s was, "Our purpose is to murder liberalism in its official robes." Their enemies were the moderate liberals, like Hubert Humphrey or something,
Hmm.
or Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, you pick whoever you want. And so, anyway, it's so Kirk was right, but once again, it ends up confusing things if you think of ideology only in its radical forms.
Yeah, and look, there's obviously a lot of directions we can go here, but I
Right.
want to squeeze this conversation, as much juice as we can out of it because there's just too many topics on the table. But
Right.
I want to get to our, because I was introduced to you, if you will, via our mutual acquaintance, friend, frenemy, maybe Seth Root. As
Oh,
I
he's a
as I said.
friend. He's
No,
right.
well,
Yeah, he's
I
right. I
meant
love
just
Seth.
more
Yeah.
on. I'm sure he's a
Right.
friend on your end. I just meant as a Burke conservative,
Oh.
I have to say everything a little tongue in cheek toward him. I love Seth. He's
Okay.
a great guy, and we just come down different on certain issues, intellectual traditions, if you will. But he is a Straussian. I've had him on the podcast to try to help educate me on what the heck is Straussianism, and I feel like it's kind of one
Ah.
of those things where the more you learn about the subject, the more you feel like you know less about it.
Mm.
But I feel like I can at least have an intelligent conversation with someone who's never heard of this before. And I think from time to time, it's my due diligence as a Burke conservative is to occasionally pull back on the Straussian string and say, hey, there's this other. I don't want to say it's another strand of conservatism because I think there's a lot of interweavings between the two.
Yeah.
But maybe a different a different river that flows into the same lake, if you will.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering, are you well, let me just ask another unfair, vague question. What is Straussianism?
Oh boy, that's a big one. Well,
That one's
I,
probably worse than what is conservatism.
well, that really is because Strauss might or might not, if he was. Well, he died in 1973, so let's put the timeline in. And he did his major work from the 30s to the early 70s, right up to the time he died. And he might resist being called a conservative if he was with us today. I'm not sure. Or he might have resisted it then. But most of the people who studied with him were conservative Democrats. And Strauss himself, when he became an American citizen, voted for Adlai Stevenson in 1952. That was his first
Hmm.
vote. So, okay, but that was true of most of his students who later went on to become, the leading conservative political philosophers in academia. So, that shows you how much things have changed. I think there's three parts to it on the surface, and that, of course, is a loaded Straussian phrase, on the surface.
Hmm.
But first of all, he had a preference for the ancients over the moderns. In other words, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, the classical tradition, over modern political philosophy, starting with Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke. And there's a lot to unpack there. Secondly, he made a distinction between reason and revelation. What can be understood by human reason alone and what can only be known by faith. In other words, by trusting in the revealed word of God in our great revealed religions, especially Judaism and Christianity. But he didn't necessarily exclude Islam, curiously enough. And part of it was that you have to either be committed to be a philosopher, that's the rule of reason, or a theologian who accepts the authority of revealed religion, and you can't be both. I think he thought that Thomas Aquinas's attempt to synthesize the two was ultimately unsuccessful or couldn't actually work.
Hmm.
And then the third thing is, and this is the most controversial part, is he believed the greatest philosophers often engaged in what he called esoteric writing or secret teachings. And he thought the main reason for this was, this makes sense on the surface, is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, especially if you were a closet atheist or you did not agree with the dogmas of the church or the rabbinical order, you took a great risk for openly questioning those doctrines. So you would secretly teach about them, or you would be ironic and sort of hide your teaching to be accessible only to the most wise or careful reader. I mean, the modern example I give of this to make people understand what he's after is, I think there's some evidence this happened in the old Soviet Union, is, if you wanted to communicate some subversive liberal in the classical sense of the ideas in the Soviet Union, you might put it cleverly in the middle of a long, dense article that most people aren't reading very carefully. Or my favorite hypothetical example is, you might have an article that says, capitalism is terrible, it's oppressive, it's what they do in America. And, it all derives from this Adam Smith guy. And here's something Adam Smith said. And then you drop in a quote from Adam Smith. A slow person reading that would say to themselves, wait a minute, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
After that, you'd say, well, but we all know this is all wrong and terrible. And, you've just committed an act of subversion, but you've done it very indirectly, right? And
Right.
I think that, I don't know if that Adam Smith example ever happened, but I did once talk to a Russian economist who'd grown up in the Soviet Union, and he talked about how he got curious about, and he was looking at numbers and stuff, but I forget his name now, but this is 20 years ago, he told me the story. While he was a student in the Soviet Union, a graduate student, he wanted to see, and he was fluent in English, he wanted to read Paul Samuelson's famous economics textbook, which of course is very Keynesian, and most libertarians don't like it at all, but still, it departed from the Soviet party line. Well, they did have a copy in the University of Moscow library under lock and key, requiring 5 permissions to see. You couldn't check it out. And he was curious to figure out how we did certain accounting measures for gross domestic product and some seemingly very technical things. But he said, as I'm reading through more of this, and the book's not all wrong, he said he came to realize why the Soviets kept it under lock and key, because it was subversive. And so, even before the Soviet Union collapsed, he was saying this is all wrong and trying to subvert the economic doctrines of the regime, which I think is interesting. So Strauss was onto all that and had very interesting interpretations of Machiavelli in particular, but some of the medieval authors. And then, the way he would read Plato in particular is very distinctive and quite
Right.
controversial.
Right. Yeah, and that's something that, as I had the conversation with Seth quite a while back about, is that it just seems like on the surface, oh, there you go, another loaded term.
Right.
Um, Obviously, that would have had to have happened in certain instances, right? Esoteric, it makes all the sense in the world. Why? I mean, heck, Socrates was killed for the things he said.
Exactly.
Right? It would make sense why
Exactly.
certain individuals want to write in a way that's not going to get them in deep trouble with the authorities. I think it also, though, necessarily creates a sort of facade where intellectuals can play around in, where they may be reading things that aren't there in the text.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I didn't. Yeah. No, you're right. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'll jump all over that. Yeah, I do think. I think you see this in the domain of several methodologies, not just unique to the Straussians. Is
sure.
the second and third generation of people who come along, and because of the pressures in academia to be original, to find something new, you will often then go to second or third or fourth order torturing of the text, or in the case of economics, torturing the data. I see this a lot. And yeah, at that point, it becomes too clever by several halves, right?
Hmm.
So I think that is a problem. Uh, but I do think that people say, oh, now if someone's an atheist or questions the regime or wants to be a radical, that's today you don't need to write secretly. But I don't think that's true at all. And I mean, if you just think about the college campus today, and I'll tell you how I dealt with it some at my time as I put it, an inmate at Berkeley, is yeah, you can denounce capitalism all you want. You can be a proud atheist. But boy, if you question the gender ideology, you get in a whole heap of trouble in a hurry.
Right.
So, what I used to do in class is I wouldn't actually address the topic directly, but I'd find a way of bringing up that line of Lincoln's from his debates with Douglas. And partly that argument was about human nature. And Lincoln's argument was Negro slaves, as we call them then, they have the same human nature as any other person of any skin color
Hmm.
and capacities and so forth. And Douglas and others were saying no, they're a subhuman species and inferior and all the rest of that. So Lincoln would say, if you call a tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? I'd sometimes ask this question in class. You'd have somebody say five. And I'd say, what was Lincoln's answer? Now, most students today don't know. And Lincoln said the answer is four. Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg, because
Hmm.
a leg is a thing and a tail is a thing, a different thing, right? And a dog is a different thing from a human being. Because remember, one of the arguments of the slaveholders was, I should be able to take my slave anywhere just as I can take my horse anywhere.
Right. Right.
And Lincoln said that would be true if the slave and the horse were equivalent things, but they're not. Okay, so I put that out there, and I just leave it for people to draw their own conclusions. That just calling you can't a man can't become a woman by changing their pronoun on their email signature, right?
Hmm.
That part I don't say, and the clever students will figure out what I'm bringing up by that question and keeps you out of. I think a lot of people do. A lot of conservatives in academia probably do it that way. So I think sort of esoteric or secret expression is still carrying on against what is now the ruling orthodoxy of leftism on our campuses, at least, and probably in the media too.
Yeah, it's and once again, there's a lot of topics on the table. You're almost baiting me into an entire Harry Jaffa conversation. I think with this
Oh,
Lincoln dropping, if you will.
right.
But I wanted to kind of going back to the beginning where we're defining conservatism. I kind of gave you my crash, what I occasionally will do to sort of kind of make sense of things. But the other thing I found that is obviously imperfect but can be helpful is I just sort of drop names sometimes.
Mm.
That I mentioned earlier,
Oh yeah,
Roger
sure.
Scruton or Russell
Right.
Kirk. Actually, before I even get off on that, because it's just popped in my head, I heard you make a comment one time. Why was Roger Scruton so reticent to give Strauss his dues in the conservative pantheon, if you will?
Yeah. I knew Roger pretty well, and I brought it up with him one time over dinner. By the way, he was wonderful to argue with. I mean, he never got upset if you disagreed with him, or he never raised his voice. It never got acrimonious or tense. And I think I got him to back down a little. I mean, he never actually wrote about Strauss in any sustained length, and the couple of brief references are very dismissive. Like his book "I Drink, Therefore I Am," which is a really fun book about drinking. Right? He has just like one sentence dismissal of Strauss. I forget how it goes, but it was very, almost snide. But and what it came down to is that first of all, Roger's a philosopher and not a political philosopher. That's an
Hmm.
important point. I mean, and also his specialty really was the moderns. I mean, he wrote a whole book on Kant. He has nice things to say about Hegel, which I can't quite figure out. But
I
see,
did an entire podcast once with a guy like, what does he think about Hegel? I don't get
right.
this.
Oh my God, right. And is very much into aesthetics. And
Yeah.
one of the things he deplored was the decline of the philosophy of aesthetics in academic philosophy. I think he's right about that. And what he said is that he really didn't care for Strauss's esoteric writing thesis, the one we were just discussing a minute ago. He thought that actually most philosophers could be read straight up, and you didn't have to work hard to find some secret message. So he thought that method could be somewhat perverse.
Hmm.
And I think if you're just a pure philosopher trying to read it like, I don't know, not poetry is not the right comparison, but I think he was sort of put off by that. And I think also, I think it would be fair to say that Roger was quite a bit of a Burkean by temperament and philosophical outlook. And I think he probably thought Strauss's critique of historicism, we haven't talked about that as much yet. I think he thought that went too far.
Right.
And I think that was part of it. But, so I was, I say we were having a dialogue. It wasn't really an argument at all, but I think I got him to back down a little bit. And because other places he did say once in a while that when he was a young professor being hounded out of Birkbeck University in London, once is 30, 40 years ago now, that he would say, at least we had Strauss and Vogelin in the library. Nobody was teaching them, but at least it was there for inquisitive students. So he wasn't hostile the way some people are hostile to Strauss, including some
Right.
conservatives, right? So,
Kind of like at least they had Keynes in the Soviet Union, I suppose.
right, yes,
Under
right,
lock and key.
right.
And I appreciate you bringing up historicism because that is sort of intertwined
Yeah.
with where I was going to go before I completely derailed us there. What I typically do is I refer to the Mount Rushmore of Saving Elephants conservatism, which
Hmm.
individually are Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley,
Hmm.
and Thomas Sowell.
Oh yeah,
I've
right.
also written a list of 50 important conservative thinkers, and I have flirted over the years of maybe swapping out some faces here or there. I think anybody can make, to me, a compelling, convincing argument why one of those four individuals shouldn't be on there and somebody else should. But I also have found it a helpful shorthand, if you will, for at least saying, here's what I mean when I say conservatism. And I'm saying that in a sense because we kind of talked about this in the green room before I hit record, that there are, of course, Straussians who would, I think your counterpart, Lucretia, I think her head spins around every time you mention Burke and Kirk in the same sentence.
Right, right.
No place for that. But and of course, Scruton, who's much a Burkean, that's the central complaint, right? In his famous Natural Rights and History book, Strauss kind
Yeah,
of ends on this. And look, I'll be the first to admit, I've read that thing. I could probably read it 6 or 7 more times, and I'm not going to pretend like I completely understand what he's saying. But I get that it's a less than warm reception of Burke's ideas, and almost opening the door to this notion that because Burke wedded so many things outside of abstractions, that had to be in concrete
right.
examples, that he's guilty of historicism, which is what we fight in the modern era. That he's kind of in this broader line of maybe Machiavelli, maybe Locke, maybe Rousseau, even, God forbid, that everything becomes sort of rooted to your history. And as such, a lot of the excesses of the left we face today, rather than Burke being the great antidote to it, was almost the unwitting, if you will, originator of these ideas. And so
Yeah.
I'm coming to you then. How do you square this circle? Where do you land on this?
Yeah, so it was years ago that my pal Dan Mahoney, who, famous guy now, but I knew him when we were both interns in Washington D.C. in the early 1980s, and over the years we talked about this, and Dan, I think, agrees, I think, with where you're going, that Strauss was a little too harsh, perhaps, on Burke, but his summary was a good one, which is Strauss's argument against Burke comes down to the proposition that Burke attempts to be a halfway house between Aristotle and Hegel, right? Because
Mm,
what do you say? Burke described himself as a champion of natural law, pretty much in a classical extent. Or he quotes Cicero a lot, who's one of the great authors of natural law in antiquity, and about the universality of natural law, right? That famous line of Cicero that there won't be one law in Athens and one law in Jerusalem. There's one law for all human beings. So, on the other hand, Burke, his idea of prudence or experience, and which can be called historicism, is, and I state it this way, is it can only be vindicated in real regimes and real places over time. Um, in other words, and so it is kind of rooted in history. The way I've come at this lately is, and here I can invoke my great teacher Harry Jaffa, is we like to invoke that second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident and so forth.
right.
And it announces the criteria for the legitimacy of government, and it's announced as being universally valid principles, right? Lincoln's phrase was, it was an abstract truth applicable to all men in all times. Okay. In other words, it declares the unity of the human family and the fundamental ground of just government. Okay, great. But I say, let's go back to the first sentence of the Declaration for a moment. How does that read? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people
Mm-hmm.
to dissolve their bands with another people, we need to set out the reasons, right? So
Right.
right away you have the recognition in practical terms that vindicating those rights requires real regimes and real people. And when it talks about the consent of the governed, and Jaffa actually did talk about this very clearly, and it's a part of his teaching that I think his followers tend to overlook or forget about, which is that the idea of social compact is a people coming together and saying, "Yep, we agree on these principles, and we're going to form a political society based on them." And if it's 1776 and you don't agree, well, guess what? You move to Canada, right? I mean, so
Right. Right.
that's I mean, so the point is that there's the case for Burke, is that as a practical matter, these require real regimes. And here you get to Roger Scruton's great point: is it's hard to build those things up and easy to rubbish and hard to get
Right.
back again once you've done it. So, I mean, I think it's worthwhile to have these arguments because it helps sharpen our thinking and make things more precise. But I think the wholesale rejection of Burke's approach is mistaken. By the way, someone who thought that, who's now been forgotten because he's been dead 20 years or more, was Francis Canavan,
Mm-hmm.
who was a boyhood friend of Jaffa's in Brooklyn, I think, and became a Jesuit priest. And he wrote a whole book defending Burke's prudence as consistent with what sort of the wider Straussian and Jaffa view of how natural right, natural law should be understood and realized in our modern times.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's It's interesting you mentioned Jaffa again. You're still baiting me in that conversation, but and maybe I should go there
I
because
didn't.
you
I
were
didn't mean to, but
no, no, it just keeps popping up. You
right.
can't help it. I'm asking these questions, and he has a good through line, I guess, because
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember because I've underlined it heavily in his at Christ with the House Divided. He mentions Burke a few times. And,
Yeah.
and I would say in a manner that is very mixed. In some ways he praises Burke, in others he says he goes too far. And in some of the ways in which he says he goes too far as like disavowing all principles or something to that extent. I don't remember the exact words, but it's one of those things where it's like, look, I certainly understand how you can read Burke, take him seriously in the land where Jaffa did. I don't think that's entirely true. Burke himself said, and I'm going to butcher this. So this is not the exact quote, but something to the effect of, look, I'm not denying all abstract realities. Otherwise, I'd be denying providence itself.
Right.
And so a good friend of mine says he needs to come up with a better critique of people who disagree with Burke than just simply saying you're reading the guy wrong. But because it's
Yeah.
complicated, even the way he wrote, and I'll let you respond to that, but it just popped in my head. Like, what the famous line about Jaffa, of course, is William F. Buckley's.
Right.
If you think it's difficult to disagree with him, try agreeing with the guy. Or
Yeah, that's
what
right. Nearly
was
impossible. Right.
nearly
Yeah.
impossible. What was he like? What was your experience with Jaffa like?
Oh, so by the way, I mean, people who only know of him from his acrimonious exchange of letters over the years with certain people that he argued with, Walter Burns and Irving Kristol and Robert Bork and all the rest, which often turned very testy in print. In person, he couldn't have been nicer and friendlier. And he was always infinitely patient with students, especially
Mm,
over their errors. And so, if you said something in class that was, either not dumb really, because most people were too afraid to say anything dumb, but that he thought was sort of mistaken, he would spend 15 minutes patiently explaining,
mm,
sometimes for the 10th time, why you had it incorrectly. And by the way, his teaching lasted that way. You'd run into him on the street or in the store, and he would stop and want to talk to you for a long time. Sometimes I wanted to get somewhere, but he was always asking, "What are you reading? What are you doing?" Or at one point, when a bunch of us lived in a group house, he'd often call up, and there's so many times I wished I'd had a notepad by the phone because he just wanted to chat with students. And a typical conversation would be, "Did you see that stupid op-ed in the Los Angeles Times today?" And yes, no, maybe, I don't know. And then he would go on and talk about what was wrong with it. And then he might even read you the first paragraph of the letter to the editor he was drafting. But a couple times he'd give you these mini lectures and be done and say, "Darn, I should have taken notes on all that." Right. So he was like that. And
yeah.
it was always a delight to be around. And that's why sometimes his 2.5 hour classes, which wouldn't have a break in the middle, would go by, you thought, really fast. And sometimes you would go into overtime because you didn't care. It was
Yeah.
so good. So no, it was extraordinary. And it's really hard to convey it. And I know almost no other person I can think of who is quite like that. There's a few. I think Alan Bloom could be quite captivating in the classroom, and Walter Burns had that reputation at Cornell when he was a young professor there. But it was really quite extraordinary, and I always kind of regretted it. And actually, if you read his letters carefully, he would put in these personal jabs that I thought were unnecessary.
Mm.
But I think a lot of the people he was arguing with took them too personally when he didn't really mean them that personally. So
Yeah, there are one of the things I have discovered much to my delight in doing these podcasts is there's so many individuals I wished I could have met. Frank Meyer, Wilmore Kendall. I mean, they sound
right,
like even if you disagree with their politics, they just sound like complete characters. You'd never
yes,
believe it unless you got a chance to meet them.
right, yeah,
One of those for different reasons, obviously, as a character is we're coming up, of course, on the centennial celebration of William F. Buckley.
yeah,
And he is the third individual, I guess, if you will, in the Mount Rushmore of saving elephants conservatism. I don't agree with Buckley on all things. I certainly think, especially his younger years, he got some things wrong or wrong adjacent with civil
right,
rights, with America Firstism, if you will, with his getting too. Even though, to his great credit, in a lot of ways he shed the more radical elements that were clinging to the conservative movement, but he kind of hung around him for a little too long for my taste. All that being said, I put Buckley on that Mount Rushmore conservatism because I personally feel like you cannot understand American movement conservatism without,
Yeah.
or to put it another way, I don't know of any other individual who is more central to American conservatism and what we even think of as a conservative today. Is that would you go that far, or is that or is it more of a mix of no, he's important, but there's 3 or 4 other people that would maybe supersede him?
Well, no, I think you're right. Actually, let's sort of connect him with Burke for a moment. One observation to make about Burke is that unlike all the other major thinkers we think of, he never actually wrote a treatise from beginning to end, laying out his political thought. All the stuff
Right.
we read of Burke, especially his reflections, I mean, maybe understood that would be a published document, but it was a long letter to a friend, right?
Which is, by the way,
Uh,
probably why we still argue about this even to this day. What did
yeah,
the guy actually think?
yeah, and he was a practicing politician. He may not have actually known, if you pressed him, if you did drop Leo Strauss in a room with him and press him on the matter, who knows what he would have come up with. Unlike, say, Adam Smith, who did write long treatises, not just The Wealth of Nations that he's most famous for, but his, Theory of Moral Sentiments, his long lectures on jurisprudence, and so forth. So, in the case of Buckley, you see something similar. He's known for this huge volume of writings, mostly columns on current issues of the day, but often, delving into matters that connected to his Catholic faith, but also to his essential, you might say, Russell Kirk style regard for tradition and antiquity
Hmm.
and permanent things. But as we know, we know this before the Tannenhouse biography that's just out, and one of the failures, I think, of Tannenhouse's book is that he doesn't go very far in exploring Buckley's failure to write the big book. Buckley very early on wanted to write a big book that would be his contribution to political thought. And he
Right.
tried several chapters and apparently it was just a mess. And he abandoned the project. And aside from being a play on the famous Ortega book, Revolt of the Masses, we don't really know what ideas he was playing with. Apparently, there's no manuscript survives, or I think Tannenhouse or somebody would have found it. Tannenhouse apparently never, as many interviews with Buckley, never asked him to explain it. Instead, Buckley turned back to just being more of a polemicist, which I don't mean as an insult at all, and then writing novels and sailing books and all the other things he did that are great fun. In a certain way, you can credit the other part of Tannenhouse's argument is that Buckley was the great movement builder. He was eclectic or ecumenical, right? I mean,
Hmm.
National Review was a big tent for everybody, almost
Hmm.
everybody. Few people quit in dismay, but and only he, by his force of personality, could keep it all together. And so there really isn't anybody before him or after him quite like him. I mean, the one parallel I can kind of make, although I don't want to press it very far, is that Buckley made conservatism cool and hip and funny, and showed that conservatives could play in the big leagues after being marginalized for decades as being a bunch of idiots or whatever.
Right.
And he makes possible. I mean, he was part of the Goldwater effort, but he kind of it's hard to imagine Ronald Reagan without Buckley. And then
Right.
there's no successor to Buckley, and the closest thing you could find to it for a new age was Rush Limbaugh, who kind of paves the way for Donald Trump in some ways, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and even Buckley said late in life that Limbaugh was in some ways his successor as a leader of conservatives with his broad audience, right, and style and wit and all the rest. And notice that there's no successor for Rush Limbaugh in media, right? Many have tried and nobody's close. He really was a genius at it, and
So let me
here we are.
ask you then, because Buckley is Sam Tannenhouse has made several. I've heard him say this several times when he's asked why is there no William F. Buckley today. He's like, well, there was no William F. Buckley before he was born either. He was kind of unique to his time,
Right,
but that can mean one of two things. One could be he was such a truly unique individual, the only one who could have held the right together in that sense, or the
yeah,
latent conservative movement. It could also mean that he happened to exist in a time where this was even possible. I
right,
mean,
yeah,
maybe Buckley, if he were alive today, because we have social media and a
right.
plethora of ways of getting the media out there, that you just can't have this. So, is it a combination of the two, or do you think it's one over the other?
No, I think it's more the former. I do think Buckley came around the right man for the right time, because you had what dominated discourse: newspapers, and magazines, and media was limited to the networks. And then of course, he was a big star on PBS. Funny, we finally just defunded it here lately, but right. I mean, his show Firing Line did some of the best ratings that PBS had for all of its sort of obscure shows. And The other thing I've always thought was, I've already indicated the style of the person. As I put it, he had an accent that is unknown to any country or dialect I can think of, right?
Right.
And that
Right.
that made him stand out right away. And even people who are, and I should say that the failure to write the big book was probably, in an ironic way, a benefit to him and the conservative movement. Because if he laid out a treatise that said, here's conservatism and there's this and this and all the rest, I think you would have found people saying, "Well, that's not right." People wanting to quarrel with it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He was pretty libertarian in economics, but I think lot of libertarians wouldn't have liked what he came up with, and I think he also, just a hunch on my part, I think he may have shrunk from uh, asserting the core of his Catholic faith into his political thought.
Mm.
That's not to say he wasn't against abortion or anything like that. He was definitely on the side of Catholic social teaching in practical terms. But today we have this what goes by what the integralist movement, right? Which are
Right.
these very sophisticated Catholics like Deneen and Adrian Vermeule and stuff, and they really are. I hesitate to call them theocrats or advocating theocracy, but they are pushing pretty hard that Catholic moral teaching ought to be more of a source of our positive law. And that's an uphill fight. Uphill fight. I think this is again a practical matter. And if Buckley
Certainly
had been
does not make for a big tent
right,
movement.
it sure doesn't. And if Buckley had pushed that, I think he would have found he would have limited his appeal.
Yeah. Yeah, that's have you read Tannenhaus's book, by the way? I'm a
I
slow
have,
reader and about
yeah,
20% through. Oh, you have finished. Okay.
yeah,
Because what is your overall I have heard mixed reviews from, say, conservatives.
yeah,
The most on point I think was Matthew Continetti talking about from the
right,
standpoint he thought that Tannenhaus, who himself admittedly is not a conservative, Tannenhaus,
right.
that he understood anti-communism extremely well, but not necessarily conservatism. And he thought maybe that was explain some of the deficits, if you will, in the otherwise what he praised as a good book.
Yeah, I mean, let's see. I did. I'll send you a link. I reviewed the book for the Civitas Outlook people at University of Texas, and
Okay.
so there's a wealth of detail here, but some fairly odd parts that Tannenhouse doesn't really get the conservative movement. A few of his judgments are, and the book's uneven. I mean, he goes in for if you're 20% in, the next 30%, 40% is going to be similar with long digressions into the civil rights era and civil rights activism. That was
Right.
way more than you needed to make the points about Buckley and his family and all the rest of that. And it's like, why aren't you? You could strip all that out into a separate book. And then the oddest thing is, he gets up to 1980 and you're 850 pages in. And then he takes the story from 1980 to Buckley's death in 2007 in about 80 pages. He's just not interested in that decade. The book
Yeah.
should have been, so you get to that point, you wish the book had been longer or 2 volumes.
Hmm.
I have a hunch that he just got tired of the project, or the publisher said, "We've been waiting 25 years. You need to get something done."
Yeah.
But I do have one quick story about Tannenhouse. When his Whittaker Chambers biography came out, which many conservatives liked a lot,
Right.
and I caught him on C-SPAN telling Brian Lamb, "Well, what Lamb in a typical way? What'd you learn from writing this book?" And he said, "Well, I'm a chastened liberal from doing all this work and writing this up, and I realized the anti-communists were more right than I thought they might have been, and the anti-communists, the people revolted against McCarthy and all the
Hmm.
rest, were pretty unsound and." Actually, that part was the answer he gave because then I saw him at a public event and I raised my hand and I got called on. I said, "You describe yourself as chastened from writing the book. Could you say more about why and what?" And that's when he gave the answer I just gave. He didn't
Hmm.
give as much of that to Brian Lamb. But the interesting thing was, is I noticed he smiled that nervous kind of way and blushed a little bit. Because I think I was not asking this in any hostile way, but I think I, sort of caught him out on something that was a problem for him.
Do you think he knew who
And
you were?
no, not at that time. I got to know him a little bit later, a few
Okay.
times, and we were on a
Okay.
couple panels together in Washington 15 years ago. I was on a panel for his book, "The Death of Conservatism," which was a really bad book.
Right.
Anyway, so I kind of beat him up for that, but always a friendly guy. But I think the problem in that blush and his sort of halting explanation explains that the left, the old joke is the only good conservative is a dead conservative for people on the left. And,
Hmm.
Buckley, they go back and forth on Buckley. Well, he was urbane and witty, and he was friends with Norman Mailer and whatever the heck. But they still don't like him. And so the party line now on the left is, well, Buckley was pretty good, but he was bad on race, just like Republicans today. And I think Tannenhouse had to worry about protecting his left flank in writing the book.
Sure.
And that's why he obsesses with the civil rights question, and why he gives some aid and comfort. He also gives some exonerations to Buckley about this, which I think is good and decent and fair of him. But I think he wanted to give some succor to the leftists who want to blame Buckley and the conservative movement for the contemporary racism of America. And then along the way, he has some really strange judgments. And then suddenly, in the last two paragraphs of the book, essentially says Buckley was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I thought, well, I didn't find all that sliced bread in the rest of the book. So it's an odd book in that way. And, the thing is that it is 1,000 pages and no one's going to try it again for a very long time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, it certainly, what it took him 25, 27 years
Yeah.
from start to
Yeah.
finish. And I mean, he's an excellent writer too. It's
Yes.
one that I've enjoyed what I've
Yeah.
read so far, but it's always interesting when you're listening, when you read an intellectual, and not necessarily deep intellectual biography, but intellectual biography nonetheless of an individual who themselves do not ascribe to the very
Right.
philosophy they're describing.
Yeah.
Let
Yeah.
me since we have limited time, let me turn to the I guess after the closing subject I wanted to get to, the because
Right.
most of what we've been talking about, much like the Tannenhouse book, I don't want to just get up to the 80s and then spend 2 minutes
Right.
last 40 years, if you will. um, the right has undergone a lot of changes in these past many decades, and as I was kind of expressing to you in the green room, I am what one might call an extreme Trump skeptic. I use that word because in the strictest definition of the sense, I am a never Trumper, and that I've never voted for the guy.
Right.
I don't know what it means to be a never Trumper when he's in office or out of office. Like,
Right.
am I just supposed to hate whatever he is or isn't doing at the moment? I don't know what that means. But I am someone who by and large believes that the Trumpian turn of the GOP, if you will, is a net negative for the broader conservative movement and for the United States. I am also someone who, I don't want to say equally, but also bemoans the many individuals who were fellow travelers on the right who have now taken this as sort of an opportunity to discover their latent leftism, if you will. Um,
Right.
and let me be charitable there, because I've always been, if an individual's coming by their views honestly, by all means, you can go from a conservative to a Marxist. We know a lot of Marxists go from being a Marxist to conservative, and that's part of what Saving Elephants is all about. I want to, meet somebody where they're at and try to persuade them to my cause, if you will. Um, but the individuals who, because they can't countenance the direction this went, have sort of also drifted themselves, or allowed themselves to be taken in by another worldview. And so I guess maybe the easiest way I could do that in shorthand is just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. I am against Trump, not in a bulwark sense, but more in a the dispatch sense of the word.
Okay. Yeah.
And so if I can kind of peg myself there, I just want to leave. Take this wherever you want to take it, but I just want to say,
Right.
where am I wrong? What am I missing? Why should I not be with the dispatch, but with someone who sees Trump as maybe a more, not whole positive, but more a net positive for the right?
Yeah. So I will come down to the latter point that he's been a net positive with this asterisk. We're going to have to see what comes after him, whether what I call Trumpism can be sustained by other people or not, right?
Yeah.
It may be that it's just him. And we'll come back to that point. Look, I was violently opposed to Trump in 2015 when he showed up. I was one of the 28 writers on that National Review cover story. I think I'm on a blackball list of the Trump White
I
House
did
sort of
not
appointment.
know
Yeah.
that.
Yes. Yeah, I was. I have to say, what I wrote about him turned out to be completely and utterly wrong. I'll
Mm-hmm.
just skip over that embarrassment for now. He's kind of won me over, although I do share this reservation about him and the people you mentioned who seem to have turned their views on a dime. You do worry that at his core, his main principle is his own narcissism and loyalty to himself. All politicians have that trait up to a point, even the
Mm-hmm.
ones I love the most, like Ronald Reagan. It comes with being a politician, but he's way out there on the bell curve distribution of such traits.
Sure.
I mean, he abuses the privilege, put it that way. And I don't sometimes like the style of a lash out to somebody who, one day or the next. I knew last fall that he and Musk were going to have a divorce at some point. It's just the nature of the two people, right?
It was inevitable.
Right,
Yeah, I'm surprised it took as
right.
long as it did.
Right, and I do have to say here, I'll agree with you also that I have also had whiplash watching, people I've known a long time who've always been people of principle will suddenly say, "Yeah, tariffs, these are great. Industrial policy, yeah." And
Yeah.
I raise my hand and say, "So we should have been for Walter Mondale in 1984." I mean, the so-called national conservatives, many of whom are friends, many of their things I have a lot of agreement with, but I say, really, when did we decide that the Walter Mondale's platform from '84 is what we want? We called it socialism then. I remember this
Hmm.
vividly. I was alive then, right? And that's astounding, how easily some people have made that shift. And listeners who pay attention will know some of the people I'm naming. I do think, by the way, you said you made the point between dispatch and bulwark. Um, the bulwark, I can confuse sometimes. I said, why don't they just merge and become the bull patch? Like, sounds
Well, they
bad.
occasionally have some very vicious disagreements with each other.
Well, I think they're kind of angry with each other for having names that confuse people. But Bill, Bill Crystal, who I've known for 40 years and used to write for a ton at the Weekly Standard. It's one thing to say you don't like Trump for some reasons you've named and others, and that I've actually just indicated some agreement with. It's another thing to suddenly change all your positions on the issues. I mean, Bill's
Right.
become a person of the left, and that I don't get. And I've tried to ask him and don't get confidentially with emails, right? Because I do know him pretty well, and I've got very unsatisfactory answers, and which I don't. Okay, so here's what's won me over about Trump. Um, let's see how to put it this way. Well, my joke in his first term is, "I'll be darned, he sold out to us." And by that I mean, you had a pretty. I mean, aside from the trade questions and some others, which we can go into if we want to bore listeners a lot, he had a pretty conservative administration, and he was pretty aggressive about things. Now he was too slow on some things. In the second term, I'm convinced it just doesn't matter of observing a political statesman. He had those 4 years to reflect on how things went in his first term. And
Hmm.
boy, are they so much more together in this term so far. And they've been
Hmm.
fast and deliberate. There's not some of the fumbling around. There's some of the usual drama with Trump, but they're moving fast and deliberate, and they've got plans and they're executing. And just by the freak out of the left shows how I think effective he is being and his administration is being. And in particular, I don't quite know sometimes what Trump knows as an intellectual matter, but he seems to have instincts or somewhere in between. But he understands the problem of what we clear monsters have called the administrative state. And this very interesting interview he gave for the Spectator World about 6 or 8 weeks ago to Ben Domenech. He says, "Oh yeah, Nixon says, that guy shouldn't have resigned. He should have toughed it out. His enemies were out to get him. And
Hmm.
yeah, Watergate was bad." I thought that's interesting. He actually perceived the fight that Nixon was trying to take on, and I don't think he's reflected much on Reagan. But the Reagan, I think in one sentence, the experience of the Reagan years was the problem of bureaucratic government is a lot harder than they thought. They thought that they could just deregulate things and do some other things, and some of that made some progress, but they came away from that realizing, oh, the administrative state is dug in, or the deep state, some people like to say, which I think is not the best phrase, but it's easy. So it's dug in a lot deeper than we thought, and rooting it out is harder than we thought. And so, I mean, I sit back and say, yeah, I'll bet they're going to make a lot of mistakes. Some budget cuts will be bad. Certain other measures will be bad. But at this point, things are so comprehensively bad that there's no way, to use the old Marxist phrase, there's no way you're going to be able to make a new omelet without breaking a lot of eggs. And a lot of stuff needs to get broken. And I like what I'm seeing. And so, anyway, I think the guy's instincts, in other words, he's just got more guts and more stubbornness than any Republican president. I mean, we're used to the Bushes selling out on inauguration day.
Hmm.
We're tired of that, and so all of a sudden, Trump, he would have been our first choice. I was for DeSantis in the last election cycle. I think still think he'll be a great president if he succeeds to the office at some point. But Trump's really impressing me, so that's where I land on it.
So where's and there's obviously a lot, like everything has to. There's a lot there we can unpackage,
Yeah,
and so I'm just trying to um I'm trying to replay the history in my mind up until 2016, because as I often say, you don't get a Trump unless there was something wrong in the
yeah,
GOP, right? And so if back on Earth 2.0, I wish Donald Trump had never been nominated the second time. Certainly not the second time, but the first time either. But it's like, okay, so what? I don't think that means the solution then was Jeb Bush, right?
Yeah.
It's not a. In other words, it's not a. There was nothing wrong. There was no need for change. It's a, okay. Well, what does that alternative path look like? And I, I know it's easy to just sort of drop names. I don't necessarily mean to, but I would prefer a Earth 2.0 be governed by a Mitch Daniels or maybe a Paul Ryan
Oh,
type.
right.
Now, maybe that is a continuation of a Bush era. I know there was certainly the latent Tea Party movement was seemed to be headed by your Ted Cruz types, say.
Yeah.
I was not a fan of Ted Cruz because while I recognize, yes, he was a fighter, I also thought he was more a firebrand and an instigator of things, just being anti-establishment to a degree that, ironically, I think Trump had that in spades. And
Right.
so it puts me in this weird position to where I'm against the establishment, but that doesn't mean I'm for everyone else who happens to be against it. In the same sense that I think you're correct that Trump sees the problems with the administrative state. I think he sees the
Yeah.
problems with immigration. I think these are all things that the American people, and maybe I could just say the right, to some, not all Americans, but the right was beating its head against the wall, trying to convince the Republican Party this is a problem we needed to change, and they were ignoring their constituents, and as a result, we end up not with someone who could possibly solve the issue, but someone who is able to. So maybe the easiest way to express is this: I was never really a member of the Tea Party, but I was really
Mhm.
interested in them when they
Right.
started off. And one thing I noted, I felt this so strong in my bones. The Tea Party comes about during Barack Obama's administration, but I really think a lot of it was anger over the Bush administration.
Yes.
Just my right. It was a sort of, at last, here's someone we can be angry with, even though we're all kind of angry with Bush too. And then you end up with, Trump comes along and tells Jeb Bush to his face, 9/11 happened when your brother was president. He wasn't booed off the stage. It's like, wow,
Right.
there's a lot of anger there. And I think I had mistaken the fervor of the Tea Party was a demand for return to limited government, when in reality, I think what it was an anger against the establishment.
Yeah.
I'm
I think
angry
it's
with the
right.
establishment. Don't get me wrong. I do not like the establishment. I think they failed us, but I don't think that means just tearing apart the establishment is all I want. I actually
Right.
wanted a more Reagan-esque, Mitch Daniels, if you will, type administration.
Yeah. Okay. So let me restate the problem this way. Well, first of all, I'll just stipulate this, and you can't do counterfactuals. But if you hadn't had Trump in 2016, we probably would have been stuck with Jeb Bush. We would have had a
Yeah.
third Bush administration with the same kind of results, which would be good in
Heck,
some
I even
areas,
say,
but
I don't know if you'd agree or not, but I think if we never had a Barack Obama, we probably would have never had a Donald Trump. In other words,
yeah,
had
that could
McCain
be
or
right.
Romney defeated him, I think there wouldn't have been
Right.
this sense that we're losing all the time. We wouldn't have needed this guy that's always fighting, fighting, fighting.
It's funny. There are some liberals who will sotto voce say, we really would be better off right now if Romney had won the 2012
Yep.
election. He's a guy, and he was for the climate change nonsense and all kinds of other he was
Yep.
useless as he's proved in the Senate. But my mentor Stan Evans, he said way back in the Nixon years, he didn't like Nixon, but he said, "Why is it whenever one of us gets in a position of power to do some good, he's no longer one of us?" The more recent variation of that, which may have started with Grover Norquist, I'm not sure, is too many people come to Washington, say they're going to drain a swamp, only to discover it's a hot tub. Right? They get very comfortable
Yeah.
there. So the problem with this is actually partly true of the Reagan administration. Is too many people come to Washington, and then maybe conventional conservative Republicans. Mitch Daniels is an exception to this, and we talk about him some other time, maybe, because I would love to have been for him to have been president too.
Yeah.
But too many conventional ones come and they get swallowed up by the bureaucracies. It's like the Yes Minister series or Yes Prime Minister. They're easily bamboozled. And in the Reagan years, again, I've studied that so carefully. You can really tell the difference between the people who are true blue Reaganites and had a bad attitude, as I put it. They came in wanting to really smash China and make big changes. In other words, they had a bad attitude. Whereas conventional Republicans, that would be Elizabeth Dole, who was
Hmm.
transportation secretary, they come in, they're very conventional Republicans. And, Reagan himself perceived this problem, and it's a long story about why he did or didn't do different things. But he would say, yeah, there's certain people who want to make a fight with the bureaucrats and certain people who don't. Okay, so what you got from Bush was that problem much. In fact, when George H.W. Bush became president, that transition, moving in place of the Reagan people, was more hostile than a transition between two different parties. And the Bush people said, no, wait a minute. We appointees of Bush, we have mortgages. We don't have ideologies. They're much career patterns. And,
Mm-hmm.
I could go on for a rant for an hour on Bush's appointees and some of his decisions. And George W. Bush was a little better, but had some of the same problems. So now we come to Trump. Most of the people he's appointing have really bad attitudes, and just the way I like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are completely crazy. I mean, RFK Jr. One of my jokes these days is only Trump could make Democrats hate a Kennedy, right? Right? And I mean, what a crazy appointment he is. But other appointments I think are just fabulous. We'll see. And the media and the left are after them, and some of them are probably going to get taken out fairly or unfairly, like Attorney General Bondi's in a whole heap of trouble, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, but I sort of like them, and you go back to Trump's first term, his Health and Human Services Secretary, after the first one flamed out over a scandal, was Alex Azar, an old friend of mine, super educated, number one in his class at Yale Law School, clerk for Scalia. And now you have RFK Jr. You couldn't have two more very different people. Alex is a very talented guy, by the way, and I haven't had a chance to talk to him about. I don't think he wants to talk about what it was like, good, bad, or otherwise. And I'm reluctant to put him on the spot. But he looks like a more of a conventional appointee for a cabinet position. Now, I will say the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, is also a good friend of mine. MIT trained physicist. I think he's the best qualified energy secretary we've ever had. And he's terrifying the climatistas, as I call them. And so he's a great appointment, however you think of it. But Trump picked him because he saw him on Fox News. And there's Chris on Fox News just kicking the hell out of the environmentalists and green energy stuff, and he really knows the case on that well. So anyway, it's fun stuff to watch that. So it's a mixed bag, but he's appointing these
Yeah.
real killers to just about everything, and he's told them go out and figuratively speaking kill people. So
Well, I obviously have a lot of airtime on here, offering an alternative view, I guess, on
right.
whether that's good or bad. So I want you to have the last word there. I won't. We can go on for another hour easily on that topic alone. But let me close then with an equally unfair question to the what is conservatism, what is Straussianism, because you mentioned up at the front that you thought Trump would be an unalloyed or a net positive, with the asterisk that we don't know what happens after Trump. And I'm not necessarily asking you to predict the future, but I'm just curious, what would a positive or negative spin on that look like? What do you think is the polls between it goes bad or it goes in a way that would be good?
Yeah.
What does the future hold potentially for a post-Trump America?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, let's just talk in raw political terms for a moment, although those are important, but we know he's attracted a large new constituencies to the Republican parties, including significant numbers of minorities who Democrats thought they had locked down.
Mm-hmm.
And the big question mark politically is, does that attach to just Trump alone, or does that now represent a permanent movement toward Republicans? There's some evidence for both of those. By the way, I think you may know this. Of all the surveys that have been come out, really careful data analysis show that all of Trump's increase in voting support over 2020 came in from minorities. He got like the same number of white votes. It's
Mm-hmm.
among blacks and Hispanics and Asians and Native Americans. I like to joke that all these land acknowledgments the left likes to do don't seem to be impressing Indians, if you use the old phrase. That a majority of Native Americans voted for Trump, which should make your head explode if you're an identitarian leftist. So are Republicans going to keep those voters? Well, we'll see. By the way, it looks like there have been some polls showing that Trump's aggressive deportations are popular with Hispanics. So there's that. And then on the ideas, we're just going to have to see if some of these things work out. I mean, is this whole tariff crusade, is this going to work where, I think the thing that you can't tell about Trump is he really believe them? Because he says, I love tariffs. Great word, my favorite word.
Yeah.
Or is this just Trump's, deal making where he's going to threaten them? Because we've been asking people, pretty please, will you lower your tariffs? Pretty please, will you spend more on defense? And now they're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's messy, it's uneven, and it could backfire, right? We could have a trade war that depresses trade and economic growth. I don't think he's going to succeed in getting a lot of manufacturing back in the U.S., or if we do, it's going to be done with robots and not human beings. And so there's a lot of question marks on how this is going to work out. And so I think there's the political question and then the substance question as to whether this new direction is going to work or not. And it all depends on those two things.
Well, as I said, we could go on easily for another hour, but
Right.
I know you've got to get. Steve Hayward, thank you so much. It's been a delightful conversation. You're a pleasure
Okay.
to. I knew you would be. You're a pleasure to talk to. You're a wealth of information. Thank you so much for taking the
Well,
time to come on
sure.
the Saving Elephant Show.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry it took so long, and my schedule's always a mess. But let's do it again sometime,
Awesome. Happy to do so.
or get Seth on at the same time, and we can. I don't know, so whatever.